As we grow older, life begins to feel a bit different. There's a quiet shift in how we view the world around us, especially the things we surround ourselves with. Things that once brought comfort or joy, old furniture, books, mementos, slowly begin to accumulate. But, in doing so, something else happens. You might not notice it right away, but with every object that takes up space in our homes, a little more of our energy gets consumed. Every piece of clutter is not just a physical item, it's a reminder of the past, a weight on the shoulders, whether we realize it or not. So, what is this hidden weight we carry after 60? You see, as we age, our lives become more about simplicity and meaning. It's easy to get caught in the rush of life, holding on to things, memories, and habits that no longer serve us. But the truth is, these things don't just take up space in our homes, they take up space in our minds, too. This stuff, these objects, represent the remnants of a life lived, experiences, challenges, accomplishments, and even regrets. It's easy to feel attached to them, as they hold sentimental value, they remind us of who we were, what we've been through. But, at some point, they can also hold us back. Think of it like this: every cluttered room, every corner filled with items you haven't used in years, each one subtly weighs you down. It's not just about the physical clutter. It's the emotional clutter that comes with it. We carry memories, emotions, and stories wrapped up in the things we own. And while those memories can be beautiful, they can also be overwhelming. They can create a barrier between us and the future, trapping us in what's behind rather than helping us move forward into what's to come. As we approach our later years, the desire for peace and clarity becomes more urgent. We begin to crave freedom from the past, freedom from things that tie us to who we used to be. But why does decluttering matter now, more than ever? When we reach our 60s and 70s, time begins to feel like a precious commodity. Our days become more intentional. We no longer want to spend our time maintaining things that don't bring joy or serve us in any meaningful way. We want to focus on what truly matters: family, experiences, moments of peace. Every item we choose to keep is an investment of our time, energy, and attention. And as we age, these resources become more limited. We need to focus on what brings us joy and peace, not what burdens us. Decluttering isn't just about tidying up a room, it's about clearing the emotional and mental space to embrace the present and future. It's about creating room for new experiences, new memories, and a life that feels more aligned with the person we've become, not the person we were. So, the first step is to recognize the hidden weight we carry, whether it's an old coat you haven't worn in years, a stack of magazines you've long since read, or a dusty bookshelf filled with books you no longer have the time to read. Each of these things carries an emotional and mental cost, even if it's invisible at first, and this is why decluttering isn't just a task, it's a form of self-care. A way to lighten the load we carry into our later years. It's a way to simplify our lives and create a space that reflects who we are today, not who we were yesterday. It's time to ask yourself, what's holding you back? What in your home is weighing you down, both physically and emotionally? That's what this journey of decluttering is all about: finding freedom. Freedom from the past. Freedom from unnecessary things. And ultimately, freedom to embrace the beauty of simplicity, peace, and joy. As we continue this exploration together, let's take the first step in our journey, by looking at the things around us that no longer serve us. As we journey through life, one of the most intimate relationships we have is with the clothes we wear. Our clothes tell stories, stories of who we were, who we wanted to be, and who we are now. But what happens when those clothes no longer fit? Not just in size, but in spirit. Clothes are more than just fabric and thread. They're a form of self-expression. From the tailored suit that once made us feel confident at work, to the casual sweaters that kept us warm during family holidays, our wardrobe holds memories of who we were at different stages of our life. Yet, as we age, our relationship with our clothing often becomes more about function than fashion, more about comfort than the latest trends. However, there comes a time when we must ask ourselves, are these clothes still serving me? Or are they holding me back? As we age, our bodies change. What once fit perfectly may now be too tight or too loose. Clothes that once flattered our figure may no longer feel comfortable or appropriate for our lifestyle. But it's not just the fit that's important. It's the energy these clothes carry. Think about it. How many times have you held on to a shirt or a jacket because it reminded you of a past achievement, a time when you felt strong, successful, or youthful? Maybe it's the outfit you wore to your last big promotion, or the dress you wore on your honeymoon. These clothes hold sentimental value. They are imbued with emotions that make it difficult to let go. Yet, keeping them often means keeping a version of yourself that no longer exists. When you keep clothing that no longer fits your life, it's as if you're holding on to a version of yourself that is not aligned with who you are today. It's a subtle, but powerful, form of resistance to change. And just like other forms of clutter, it weighs on your spirit. Letting go of clothes that no longer serve you isn't just about freeing up closet space, it's about freeing your mind and your heart from outdated self-concepts. It's about accepting that you are no longer the person you were years ago and that it's okay to evolve. In fact, it's essential for growth. By shedding clothes that no longer represent who you are, you create space for new energy and a more authentic self-expression. And this isn't just about material possessions, it's a symbolic act of letting go of what no longer serves your journey, your true identity. Now, let's get practical. How do we begin this process of letting go? 1. Start with the clothes that don't fit physically. Look at your wardrobe and ask yourself, when was the last time I wore this? If it's been over a year, or it's too small or too large, it might be time to let go. Ask yourself, does this item reflect who I am today? Or am I holding on because it represents a past version of myself? 2. Tackle sentimentality with intention. It's okay to feel emotional about certain items. But when you find yourself holding on to a dress or shirt just because it reminds you of a particular time or person, take a moment to reflect, does this memory serve me? If it does, maybe keeping the item is fine. If not, consider donating it or passing it on to someone who might truly appreciate it. 3. Opt for comfort and function. As we age, comfort becomes a priority. The clothes we wear should reflect our current needs, not past ones. Focus on clothing that allows you to move easily, breathe comfortably, and feel confident. When you embrace the reality of your body today, you create space for a wardrobe that nourishes you, both physically and emotionally. 4. Be mindful of how clothing makes you feel. Does the fabric feel soft? Does the color make you feel alive and energized? Or do certain pieces make you feel heavy, uncomfortable, or even frustrated? When we wear things that no longer serve us, whether because they're too tight, too loose, or simply outdated, we carry the weight of those decisions every day. Choose pieces that make you feel light and at peace. When we begin to clear out our closets, we are not just clearing physical space. We are making room for a new chapter in our lives, one where we are free to express who we truly are, without the constraints of past identities. Letting go of these outdated clothes is an act of self-liberation. It's about choosing what empowers us now, not what once defined us. Think of it as a metaphor for aging itself. We can choose to hold on to the past, clinging to what no longer fits us, physically or emotionally, or we can choose to embrace the present and future, letting go of the things that no longer serve us and making space for a new way of being. In the process of letting go of clothes, we allow ourselves to fully step into the present moment, where we are now, who we are today, and who we have yet to become. And just like every piece of clothing that no longer fits, we too can shed old identities and embrace the freedom of living authentically. It's incredible how many things we accumulate over the years, isn't it? Every time we buy something new, whether it's a gadget, an appliance, or a piece of furniture, we tell ourselves that it will serve us. But, more often than not, these things end up forgotten, tucked away in closets or shoved into storage, only to be discovered years later, collecting dust and occupying space, both physically and mentally. Do you have things in your house that you haven't used in ages? A blender that's been sitting in the back of the cupboard? An old record player that hasn't been plugged in for years. A stack of unused exercise equipment gathering dust in the corner of the room. These are just a few examples of items we often hold on to. Despite knowing they no longer serve us, when you step back and look at your home, you'll likely see a pattern: the forgotten possessions, the things you haven't used in months or even years. These items aren't just clutter, they're reminders of promises we made to ourselves, of plans that never came to fruition, and goals we didn't quite reach. Each of these forgotten possessions represents a fragment of who we were, what we thought we needed or wanted at some point in the past. But as time goes on, these objects become outdated. They no longer reflect who we are today or who we want to be. Holding on to things we don't use anymore isn't just about the space they take up. It's about the emotional weight they carry. Every object we hold on to has a story, a memory, or an expectation attached to it. When we refuse to let go, we're also refusing to release the past, the versions of ourselves that are no longer relevant to our current life. How many times have you held on to an item, thinking, "I might use this one day"? Or perhaps, "It costs so much, I can't just throw it away." We often keep things because we feel guilty about parting with them, but in doing so, we carry the emotional burden of unfinished business, things that didn't live up to their promises, goals that were never realized, and memories that have become too distant to serve us any longer. Letting go of these forgotten possessions isn't just about making your home tidier. It's about freeing yourself from the expectations and unrealized dreams attached to them. It's about acknowledging that things don't always go according to plan, and that's okay. Life moves on, and so must we. When you release the unnecessary objects, whether it's that pile of unused kitchen gadgets, the collection of old magazines, or the stack of DVDs you no longer watch, you create space for clarity, both in your home and in your mind. So, how do we begin letting go of these forgotten possessions? Here are some steps to guide you through the process. 1. Start small. Begin with the items that are most obviously outdated or unused. Open a cupboard, and pull out that blender you haven't used in years. Think about the last time you used it. If you can't remember, it's time to let it go. Ask yourself, does this item still serve me? If not, it's okay to say goodbye. 2. Be intentional about your belongings. Before acquiring anything new, ask yourself, will this truly improve my life? Or is it just a temporary distraction or impulse buy? By being more intentional with what we bring into our homes, we can avoid accumulating things that eventually become clutter. 3. Donate or sell items that are still in good condition. Sometimes, the best way to part with things is to pass them on to someone who might still use them. If you're not ready to throw something away, consider donating or selling it. It's a wonderful way to share with others while freeing up your own space. 4. Get rid of guilt. Letting go of forgotten possessions can stir up feelings of guilt or regret, especially if you've invested a lot of time or money into them. But remember this, letting go is not about failure, it's about growth. It's about making room for the things that truly matter now, not holding on to things from the past that no longer serve your purpose. 5. Simplify your spaces. Look around your home and identify areas that are overcrowded with things you don't use. Start by clearing out one small section at a time. When you simplify your physical space, you create a sense of peace and control over your surroundings, which can help alleviate the mental clutter that comes with holding on to things that no longer serve a purpose. When you begin to let go of forgotten possessions, you are not just cleaning your house, you are reclaiming your life. You are choosing to release the past and focus on the present. Each item you let go of is a step toward a more peaceful, intentional life. A life where you can be free of the weight of things you don't need. As we get older, time becomes more precious. Our lives are no longer about accumulating more stuff, they're about accumulating experiences, memories, and peace of mind. Every object we hold on to that no longer serves us is a reminder of how we used to live. Letting go of these things is a powerful declaration that we are ready to embrace who we are today, not who we were yesterday. So, ask yourself, what are you holding on to that no longer serves you? And, more importantly, what would it feel like to let go? by shedding the old, the outdated, and the forgotten, you open up space for the new, space for joy, for clarity, and for the simple pleasures that matter most. The journey of decluttering is not just about getting rid of things, it's about creating space for the life you want to live, right here, right now. We all have them. Those broken things we keep in the back of the drawer, the closet, or even the garage. A lamp with a flickering light bulb, a phone with a cracked screen, a broken chair that no longer holds weight, or a television that's been collecting dust for years, still waiting for that, someday, repair. You know the ones, items that no longer work but are too difficult to part with. We tell ourselves, I'll fix it someday, or I might need it for parts. Yet, day after day, these broken things sit in our homes, reminding us of what no longer serves us. But here's the truth, broken things take up more space than we realize. Not just physical space, but mental and emotional space. Every time we look at that cracked vase or the broken kettle, our subconscious holds on to the thought, I need to fix this, I'll get around to it, or this could be useful one day. And in doing so, we are continually holding on to things that no longer function in our lives. We hold on to these broken things, not just because we think they can be repaired, but because they remind us of something we're reluctant to let go of. Maybe it's a time in our life when we were more capable, when we had the energy or the resources to fix things, or maybe it's because we feel like getting rid of them means acknowledging a small defeat. We don't want to admit that something is beyond repair. But the real cost of keeping broken things goes beyond the physical clutter. It's the emotional weight they carry. Each broken item symbolizes something that's no longer functioning properly in our lives, a relationship, a goal, a dream. And every time we see it, we are subconsciously reminded of unfinished business. This can lead to a feeling of lingering stagnation. So, what happens when we finally decide to let go of these broken things? Letting go of broken items is an act of relinquishing the past. It's saying, I'm no longer going to invest time, energy, or emotional space into something that's no longer serving me. It's a way of freeing yourself from the belief that everything can or should be fixed. When we keep broken things, we're holding on to the idea that we can fix what's beyond repair. But sometimes, the most freeing thing we can do is acknowledge that not everything needs to be fixed. Some things are meant to be let go. By letting go of broken items, we create space for new opportunities, new energy, new perspectives, and the peace of mind that comes with decluttering both your physical and emotional environment. It's about making room for things that truly serve your current life, not the life you had when you tried to repair that broken object. Let's dive into how we can begin the process of releasing these items. Here's a step-by-step guide to help you get started. 1. Assess the damage. Look at your broken items and ask yourself, is this fixable? If the answer is no, then it's time to let it go. If it's something that's beyond repair, ask yourself, does keeping this broken thing serve me? If it's just taking up space in your mind and your home, it's time to part ways. 2. Acknowledge the emotional attachment. It's natural to feel attached to certain things. Whether it's the lamp you received as a gift, the chair that once belonged to your grandparents, or the old kitchen appliance that reminds you of a time when you were more independent, it's important to recognize the emotional connection. However, keeping an item because of sentimental value should not mean you hold on to something that's no longer useful or healthy for you. Honor the memory, but let go of the item. 3. Repair or replace. If the item is truly something that can be fixed and you have the means and motivation to do so, then by all means, repair it. But, if the thought of repairing it has been hanging over your head for months or years, consider replacing it with something new, functional, and in alignment with your current lifestyle. Make a conscious decision, fix it or let it go. 4. Don't guilt yourself. It's easy to feel guilty about getting rid of something that was once valuable or useful. But the purpose of letting go is not to discard memories or experiences, it's to free yourself from the burden of something that no longer serves your current needs. When you choose to let go, you are making room for new experiences and new energy in your life. 5. Create space for what works. after letting go of broken things, take the time to curate your space with items that bring joy, functionality, and peace. Focus on things that are not only beautiful but also serve a purpose in your life today. When you surround yourself with things that work and reflect who you are now, you create an environment that supports your well-being. The act of letting go of broken things represents more than just cleaning out your home, it's a symbol of emotional release. It's the acceptance that sometimes things don't work out, and that's okay. Life moves on, and so must we, by releasing the broken items from our lives. We free ourselves from the burden of trying to fix what cannot be fixed. We create space for the present moment, where things work, where life is in flow, and where we are not weighed down by the past. So, ask yourself, what are you holding on to that's broken? What would it feel like to let go of it? We've all been there. A closet full of clothes that once fit perfectly, but now, they either don't fit the same or no longer reflect who we are. Clothes that are too tight, too loose, or simply out of style. Yet, we keep them, hidden in the back of our closets, gathering dust. We tell ourselves that we'll wear them again someday, or maybe just hold on to them for sentimental reasons. But the truth is, these clothes are doing more harm than good. In our youth, clothing often served as a reflection of who we were or who we wanted to be. It expressed our identity, our social status, and sometimes even our dreams. But as we age, our relationship with clothing changes. Our bodies change. Our priorities shift, and our personal style evolves. Yet, many of us find ourselves holding on to clothes from years ago. Maybe it's the jeans we used to wear when we were more active, or that dress we wore to an important event that we feel connected to. But here's the reality: outdated or ill-fitting clothes take up more than just physical space, they take up emotional and mental space too. Every time we open that closet and see clothes that no longer fit or no longer suit our lifestyle, we are reminded of the past version of ourselves. We are reminded of a time when we were a different size, a different shape, or had a different life. And although those clothes might seem like an innocent memory, they can silently weigh us down by holding us in a moment we've outgrown. Letting go of these clothes isn't just about making space in your closet, it's about releasing the past and embracing the present. It's about accepting who you are now, not who you were or who you think you should be. And more importantly, it's about honoring your body and your current self. When you let go of clothes that no longer fit, you're making a powerful statement: I honor where I am in life right now. By clearing out the clothes that no longer serve you, you create room for clothing that makes you feel good, clothing that fits, that flatters, and that supports the life you're living today. When we wear clothes that reflect who we are now, we feel more confident, more aligned with ourselves, and more comfortable in our own skin. You might wonder, why do I hold on to these clothes? There are many reasons. Perhaps you have an emotional attachment to them, or maybe you tell yourself you'll fit into them again one day. It's natural to want to keep clothes that have sentimental value or that remind us of a time in our lives when we felt more confident or successful, but it's important to recognize that keeping clothes that no longer serve you isn't necessarily an act of sentimentality. It can also be a form of self-denial. It's holding on to an idea of yourself that no longer aligns with the person you are today. And in doing so, we may unintentionally make it harder for ourselves to move forward. Letting go of outdated clothing can feel difficult, especially if they hold sentimental value or if we believe that we might need them again someday. But the process doesn't have to be overwhelming. Here are some steps to help you get started. 1. Assess what you have. Start by taking a good look at your closet and drawers. Ask yourself, do I wear this? Does this fit me? Does this represent who I am today? If the answer is no, then it's time to say goodbye. 2. Be honest about your body. As we age, our bodies change, and that's perfectly okay. Honor these changes by acknowledging what fits you now, both physically and emotionally. Holding on to clothes that no longer fit isn't just about the physical discomfort, it's about resisting the changes that are a natural part of aging. Accept that your body has evolved, and embrace clothing that flatters your current shape. 3. Create a style that reflects who you are today. Let go of clothes that no longer suit your lifestyle or taste. Instead, start building a wardrobe that reflects who you are now and what makes you feel good. Don't be afraid to experiment with new styles, colors, and patterns that resonate with your current self. Clothing is meant to enhance your life, not drag you back to a time you've outgrown. 4. Use the 1-year rule. If you haven't worn a piece of clothing in the past year, it's probably time to let it go. You might think you'll need it again, but chances are, you won't. Apply the same rule to clothes that are too tight, too loose, or too outdated. If you haven't worn it in a while, it's time for it to go. 5. Donate or sell what no longer fits. When you're ready to part with these clothes, consider donating them to charity or selling them online. Giving away or selling your clothes not only clears your space but also allows someone else to benefit from what you no longer need. This creates a positive flow of energy. What you no longer use can serve someone else. The benefits of letting go of outdated clothes are far-reaching. First and foremost, it creates space in your home, which leads to less mental clutter. The more you let go of what no longer serves you, the more peace and clarity you create in your life, but the benefits don't stop there. When you let go of these clothes, you also make room for self-acceptance. You stop holding on to the past and start honoring who you are today. And in that space, you can begin to build a life that's more aligned with your present self, one that reflects your current lifestyle, values, and priorities. In many ways, letting go of outdated clothes is a small but significant metaphor for aging. As we grow older, we shed the layers of our past selves, allowing space for new experiences, new perspectives, and new ways of being. By embracing the changes that come with age, we allow ourselves to live with greater authenticity and peace of mind. As you stand in front of your closet, ready to part with clothes that no longer serve you, remember this: letting go isn't about loss, it's about making room for what truly matters. In every home, there's usually a hidden treasure trove of electronics that no longer serve a purpose. Old televisions, radios, phones, and even outdated computers sit in drawers or gather dust in the corners of rooms. These items, while seemingly benign, can hold more weight than we realize. They symbolize wasted time, unmet expectations, and perhaps even an old version of ourselves. And, without us realizing, they contribute to a feeling of disorder and mental clutter. Technology evolves quickly. What seemed cutting-edge a decade ago is now obsolete. Yet, many of us have an emotional attachment to these items. The old television that was once a centerpiece of family gatherings, the camera that captured memories of vacations, or the computer that held our work and personal projects. These devices, though no longer functional or useful, hold on to the past, keeping us tethered to outdated moments. In some ways, holding on to old electronics is like holding on to outdated beliefs or memories. We keep them because they remind us of simpler times, or maybe because we just haven't taken the time to deal with them. But what we might not realize is that these items can drain our energy, both physically and mentally. They clutter our physical space, sure, but they also clutter our mental space. Why do we hang on to old gadgets, even when they no longer work or serve a real purpose? One reason might be sentimentality. These electronics may represent milestones in our lives: the first cell phone, the first computer, or the television we bought after years of saving. They might remind us of a time when we felt connected, successful, or engaged with the world in a different way. Another reason is the belief that we might need these items again someday. We think that one day, we'll find a use for that old printer, or maybe we'll finally repair that broken radio. The truth is, the more we hold on to these items, the more we risk holding on to outdated versions of ourselves, versions that no longer fit who we are today. The clutter of old electronics doesn't just take up room in your home, it can also cloud your mind. Every time you open a drawer or glance at an old television, you are reminded of the unfinished business of letting go. This mental clutter can weigh heavily on us, leaving us feeling stuck and even a bit overwhelmed. Not to mention, these devices take up valuable storage space. They fill up drawers, take over countertops, and create an illusion of abundance where there is none. This physical clutter creates a chaotic environment that can leave you feeling unsettled, which in turn affects your peace of mind. Imagine the freedom that comes with clearing out these old items. When we declutter our homes, we often feel a lightness, a sense of freedom and space that extends beyond our physical surroundings. Getting rid of electronics that no longer work or serve a purpose is an important part of that process. Here's how you can begin. 1. Assess each item. Start by going through your drawers, cabinets, and storage areas. Take out each electronic device and ask yourself, do I use this? Is it functional? Can I repair it? Will I need it in the future? Be honest with yourself about whether this item still serves a purpose in your life. If the answer is no, it's time to let it go. 2. Think about the energy it occupies. Every item you hold on to carries with it a certain energy, an energy that can either be empowering or draining. When you hold on to broken electronics, you're not just holding on to objects, you're holding on to stagnation. Think about the kind of energy you want to cultivate in your home. Do you want to be surrounded by outdated, non-functional items that drain your energy? Or do you want to create a space of clarity and renewal? 3. Donate or recycle. If the item is still functional but no longer serves your needs, consider donating it to someone who could benefit from it. Recycle old gadgets that are no longer working. Many electronics stores and local recycling programs offer services to safely dispose of old electronics in an environmentally friendly way. Recycling not only clears your space, but it also ensures that your items don't end up in landfills. 4. Set a rule for future purchases. One of the reasons old electronics pile up is because we continuously buy new items without getting rid of the old ones. Start setting limits on how many electronics you keep in your home. Consider whether each new purchase is truly necessary or if you can make do with what you already have. When you do purchase new items, make a habit of getting rid of the old ones in a timely manner. By letting go of these old electronics, you're not just making room in your physical space, you're also decluttering your mind. When our surroundings are tidy and organized, our minds tend to be more clear and focused. The act of letting go can also be an act of self-care. It's an acknowledgement that you deserve a space that supports the person you are now, not the person you used to be. The benefits are immediate. You'll feel more relaxed, more present, and more at peace in your home. Without the distraction of outdated technology, you can focus your energy on the things that truly matter. As we age, it's natural to accumulate things over the years. But at some point, we must learn to release what no longer serves us. By letting go of old electronics, we make a choice to embrace the future, to open ourselves up to new experiences, and to simplify our lives in a way that fosters growth and well-being. When we declutter our environment, we create space not just for new things, but for new possibilities. And that's a choice worth making. As we come to the end of this journey through decluttering, it's important to reflect on the powerful transformation that's possible when we choose to let go. The process of clearing out the unnecessary, whether it's old clothes, unused kitchen gadgets, forgotten furniture, or outdated electronics, goes beyond just tidying up. It's about creating mental space, embracing simplicity, and ultimately welcoming happiness. Throughout our lives, we accumulate possessions, experiences, and even emotional baggage. It's easy to hold on to things because they represent comfort, memories, or the past. But as we age, it's essential to ask ourselves, do these things still serve us? Do they help us grow? Or are they simply taking up space in our homes, and in our hearts? When we declutter, we aren't just getting rid of physical items, we're also clearing away the mental noise. We're choosing to create space for the present moment, for joy, for peace, and for the future. Decluttering isn't about perfection or minimalism for the sake of it. It's about conscious choices. It's about making room for the things that matter most, our relationships, our passions, our health, and our well-being. As we reach our senior years, the clutter in our homes can begin to feel overwhelming. The years of accumulation, Things we once thought were important, things we inherited, and things we were simply too busy to deal with, can all contribute to a feeling of being weighed down. The clutter not only takes up space but also steals our energy, both physical and emotional. But here's the good news, it's never too late to start fresh. When we declutter, we regain control over our environment. We choose what we allow into our homes, and in doing so, we shape our environment to align with our values, desires, and aspirations. The act of letting go of the old can bring a sense of liberation, freedom to move forward, free from the burdens of the past. Imagine a home where every item has a purpose, where every piece of furniture, every decoration, and every tool you use contributes to your well-being. A space that feels open, airy, and calm. By letting go of what no longer serves us, we open ourselves up to a life that's less chaotic, more intentional, and ultimately more fulfilling. When we create space in our physical environment, we often create space in our minds as well. Without the distractions of too much stuff, we can focus more on what matters, spending quality time with loved ones, enjoying the beauty around us, and investing in our health and happiness. By now, we know that decluttering isn't just about tossing things away. It's about choosing a lifestyle that supports our mental and emotional well-being. Here are just a few of the benefits that come with a simpler, decluttered life. Less stress. A cluttered home can contribute to feelings of anxiety and stress. A tidy space helps foster calmness and relaxation, more time and energy, when you're not spending time cleaning, organizing, and managing excess stuff. You have more time and energy for what truly matters, whether it's enjoying hobbies, spending time with loved ones, or simply relaxing. Better health. A clean, organized space is more conducive to rest and rejuvenation. Reducing clutter can promote better sleep and reduce the physical strain of moving around a crowded space. A fresh perspective. Letting go of the past allows us to open ourselves up to new possibilities. When we declutter, we create room for new experiences, new opportunities, and fresh ideas. As we wrap up this chapter, think about what action you're going to take. What areas of your home could benefit from a little decluttering? Which items no longer serve you, and how can you let them go in a way that makes space for something better? Here's a small challenge for you. This week, commit to decluttering just one area of your home, whether it's your closet, your kitchen drawers, or even the old electronics gathering dust in a corner. Take it one step at a time. Small actions can lead to big changes. And the act of letting go will set you on the path to a simpler, happier life. If you've enjoyed this journey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's one thing you've decided to let go of today? How has decluttering impacted your life? Share your experiences with me in the comments below, and if you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from a little extra space in their lives. Let's create a community of people who are embracing simplicity, living intentionally, and supporting each other along the way. Remember, a clutter-free home is just the beginning of a clutter-free mind and spirit. You deserve a life filled with joy, freedom, and peace. Keep decluttering and keep living your best life, one step at a time.